Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss how Boris Johnson's Brexit mentality has caused him to break another Brexit promise, withdrawing from a scheme that was set up actually by a British guy that gives many young graduates a competitive edge in employment, and that also brings quite a lot of money into the UK economy, namely the Erasmus scheme. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, first video for me to at least record since the deal has been published. And over the next few weeks, we'll be getting into a lot of the details. But first of all, one that was fairly straightforward. So, for those who don't know, the Erasmus scheme is an EU-funded programme that allows for exchanges of university students across Europe. It could be used to enrich a student's experience just in general, particularly for those who want to enter careers in, say, business or law or science or any other field where international collaboration may be beneficial. And it gives you the experience of seeing the system from another advanced economy. Powerful CV fodder for job applications after graduation. For our American cousins, that's resumes. The scheme, which was really driven by a Welshman, it's an EU-wide scheme, it's driven by a Welshman, has helped over 5 million students spending a year studying abroad as part of their university education. And last year, Boris Johnson denied that we would pull out of the Erasmus scheme. A question was directed to him by an MP from the SNP in Parliament, who was fearing this day, who was foreseeing this. And Boris Johnson answered that the MP in question was talking out the back of his neck. He made it crystal clear that we would not be pulling out of Erasmus. And he specifically said Erasmus scheme. He didn't say, oh, we'll just replace it with another scheme. No, specifically Erasmus would not be withdrawing from it. Now, what the Prime Minister was doing with that answer, he wasn't simply denying that we would withdraw. He's denied an awful lot of things to do with Brexit that have since come to pass. But he was specifically saying, even just a year ago, that the very concept of withdrawing from Erasmus was so ludicrous. I mean, why am I even discussing it? It's absolute nonsense. You may as well try and argue that the sun will never rise again once we leave the EU. And yet, here we are. Boris Johnson has made the political decision to withdraw. But why? Did the EU say we couldn't participate? No. In fact, as far as the EU is concerned, there is not a single scheme that the UK has not been permitted to join. Remember that the EU would have preferred to maintain the status quo. You know, if we had to leave at all, their preference is that we would do what the Brexiteers promised we would do before before the referendum in 2016, which is to follow the Norway or the Swiss route. You know, that's what 100% of Brexiteers called for, including Boris Johnson back in 2016. It's not even like the EU said, look, we've got these schemes, you either join all of them or none of them. Now, when it comes to access to markets, sure, we were not allowed to cherry pick, as Angela Merkel put it. But when it came to these schemes, they're all sort of separate things. We could join as many or as few as we liked. We've joined some and not others. The deal we agreed could easily have included Erasmus participation without any other changes to the deal. It does not. And that is 100% Boris Johnson's decision. We can't even say it's the Conservatives' decision or the Brexiteers' decision. It wasn't even put to a vote in Parliament for MPs to decide on. So what's Boris Johnson's reasoning? Well, there seems to be two things he's saying. So the first is that the scheme costs too much. However, it actually makes money. You know, there are costs for the scheme, of course, administrative costs, but we also get an economic boost, because what it means is you get a load of European university students coming over here and spending their money in this country for a year. Now, when you work out all the associated costs and incomes, because you also have to consider the fact that some British universities go to European universities as well, what is the net effect? The net effect is an economic gain, I believe, of £250 million to the economy each year. On an average year, I don't imagine it was that this year. So at a time when our economy is failing badly, although at least we can't now say it's in free fall because we have avoided a no-deal outcome, but still, at a time when our economy is shrinking, Boris Johnson has chosen to pull out of a lucrative scheme with the EU, one that brings in about £250 million a year net. That is net. The second reason given is what we want to do is build up this global version of the same thing. You know, it's always about the global version. That's always his reason for coming out of the EU. Now, there are three problems with this obvious lie. The first of which is, as have been shown by the government's own calculations, when we try and run a scheme on our own, it always works out to be more expensive. For example, having our own aviation safety authority, the government have actually admitted is going to cost 10 times as much as our admin fees just to use the EU one. You know, and that's the situation there. And there's form on this specifically with Erasmus, because Switzerland were ejected from Erasmus at one point because they voted for something that contravened the agreement with the EU on freedom of movement. So Switzerland was at that point kicked out of Erasmus, and not wanting to lose out on the benefits, because, you know, even though they'd voted for what was effectively an anti-EU bill or motion, whatever, I don't know what it would be called in Switzerland, because it was one of these public referenda, nonetheless, they understood the competitive edge it gave to their own citizens. So they wanted to do the same thing. They did their own version, and it cost twice as much. The second problem is the position. Erasmus is not an exclusive scheme. You know, we've been members of Erasmus for as long as it's been in operation, and we still have student exchanges with universities in other countries outside of Europe. You know, and this is, as I say, it's another common Brexit lie about standards in general, which I'll need to revisit from time to time, inevitably. So they keep saying, well, we need to leave the EU in order to boost these standards, in order to have a better version of this thing. Absolute nonsense. EU standards are a floor, not a ceiling. There is not a single EU standard that is adopted universally across the EU. There are always countries who adopt stronger ones for their country. The EU standards are always the minimum. Same applies here. If we wanted to build up a similar scheme for outside Erasmus, or a better scheme for outside Erasmus, we could still be in Erasmus and do that anyway. As I said, we sort of did and do anyway. 3, the biggest problem of all. You don't really get to say, well, okay, you may not be able to do an exchange now with a university in France or in the Netherlands, but not to worry, because even better, you can go to Australia or America. It completely freezes out university students from working class backgrounds especially. You can travel to a university in Europe quite cheaply. You know, it's a few pounds. In fact, it can be as cheap, from where I come from, north of England, it can be as cheap to go to a university in Belgium or the Netherlands as it costs for me to travel to London, the capital of my own country. Social mobility is already a huge problem in Britain, and this puts it in reverse, because I'll tell you what that sort of university student can't do. They can get on a bus and go to Europe. They can't do that and go to Australia or America. The flight ticket would be rather expensive, in fact very expensive. So 3 reasons given, all of them lies. So what is the real reason? Well, obviously when you lie about something, the real reason has to be a matter of speculation, but an obvious one does spring to mind. So Brexit mentality is that we create a disconnect between Britain and the rest of Europe. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Various opposition parties, including, unfortunately, my own Labour Party, are completely illiterate when it comes to studying polling information. But the Conservatives are not. They hire people who will tell them exactly what the people think. People will say that these Conservative politicians are completely out of touch. You know, they appear completely out of touch. They understand perfectly well what the public believes. They know that. They're not ignorant of that. And they use that information to great effect. It's not a coincidence that a government of elitists whose beliefs and aims are far removed from the country that they govern, as it's possible to be, quite frankly, nonetheless manage to convince enough of the public that they are completely in alignment. You don't do that by accident. You have to be self-aware to be able to do that. It's a knowing lie. It's a knowing deception. Support for Brexit was mostly to be found in 2 groups. Before people get on at me at this one, there are people in both of these groups, significant numbers, that were also against Brexit, just as in terms of the main demographics that were anti-Brexit, there are significant numbers that were for it as well. But where the bulk of these people was in those who don't have as high an education and the elderly. 2 big groups there. Now, they can't really replicate the elderly. They can't clone a load of old people. Time has to do that. And in fact, it's nothing to do with the age anyway. It's more the generation they came from. And also, given that they're adopting policies that at the moment are not exactly in line with keeping the elderly in a fit state for voting at the next election, they're actually on trouble on that front. However, the young and the educated were overwhelmingly pro-EU. Well, there's going to be a whole load more of those. The Brexiteers know, they're not stupid, they know they can't afford to rest on their laurels. In 10 years' time, the swing towards rejoining will be much greater. And I don't mean just because we'll have compared Brexit with EU membership and people will have changed their minds. I hope a great deal of that happens. But that's not in itself just the only cause of the swing. You've got as the generation that largely voted for it, the elderly, as they pass on, and those that were too young to vote but pro-European become of voting age, and some already have, and more will do in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 15 years' time. The public mood will be towards rejoining. That fear of the EU is being wiped out by time. What better way for the Brexiteers to start countering this, because they're going to have to counter it, than to cut off young, educated people from experiencing the EU, create a cultural disconnect there. You know, that's how racism fundamentally works. Don't allow people to associate with the people that are supposed to be the enemy, because you'll actually just see, do you know what, they're just decent human beings like everyone else. You know, good uns and bad uns, mostly good uns. And you'll just see, do you know what, they're just people like us. They don't want people to see that, so they'd like to cut us off from Europe. Of course, there are other explanations as well. As I say, Erasmus is a great scheme for social mobility. The elitists in this Conservative government don't like that, because it means that poor kids might compete with their own snot-nosed kids. Much better if you can get the experience you need to get the very best jobs, if you have to pay hand over fist for it. That's why they like internships. They love it. Poor people can't afford to do internships. I can send little Tarquin off to do that. I'll fund him for a couple of years, no problem. And they hate Erasmus because poor people can do that. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.